Hello, everyone, and welcome back to We the Podcast. Tonight's discussion is going to be centered on a single question. What does a constitutional voting record look like when it is measured against the Constitution first and politics second? The Constitution does not operate on popularity. It establishes what the federal government is permitted to do, and just as importantly, what it is not permitted to do. It assigns limited, enumerated powers to the federal government and places the responsibility on Congress to act within those bounds. It is a safeguard against the expansion of authority beyond its proper scope. In practice, however, legislative decisions are often judged by outcome rather than authority. The question becomes whether a policy achieves a desired result instead of whether Congress is authorized to pursue it at all. And that is not just a minor detail or merely semantics. It is the dividing line between a government of limited powers and one defined by convenience. The question then is not simply how a representative votes, but by what standard those votes are made. Tonight's discussion examines that standard and what it reveals when applied consistently to a voting record. The focus tonight is the public record of Thomas Massie, including how it is characterized, how it is criticized, and how it holds up when examined directly. Before getting into that, a brief note on the recent gap in episodes. The last few weeks have been spent working on a large project of mine that is now nearing completion. That project is a collector's edition constitution that I am building. It's for the 250th anniversary of our nation's independence. It's going to be limited edition, leather-bound colonial blue. It's going to be debossed and embossed. You'll be able to feel the wings of the eagle. And it will have all of the founding documents of the United States collected all within one book. So it's going to have the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, all of the remaining amendments. It will also have Madison's notes on the convention. It'll have the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers, as well as various quotes from our founding fathers. I currently have pre-orders up on my website, wethepodcast.square.site. So please check that out. It's going to turn out to be a very, very passionate project of mine because I love this country. I love what it stands for. I love our Constitution. And I want to celebrate the 250th anniversary with something special. I originally started building this book for myself and had people showing interest in it. So I am making it a limited edition with only 250 copies that will be made. But going back to tonight's episode, the discussion, the objective is going to be pretty straightforward. To take a public record, remove the surrounding narrative, and evaluate it on its own terms against the Constitution. If you have followed this issue or have your own view on it, that perspective matters, and the most useful discussions are the ones grounded in the actual record, not the assumptions about it. If you want to take a much deeper dive into who Thomas Massie is, check out my other book, The Last Republican, Thomas Massie and the Death of a Party. You can find that on Amazon. The links to both Thomas Massie and the Constitution are in the description. And with that in mind, the analysis begins with the question that drives much of the criticism. To start off tonight, many throw around the term rhino. In current political discourse, labels are applied quickly and often without definition. Terms like rhino and traitor are used to describe any departure from party alignment, regardless of context or substance. That approach raises a more fundamental issue. Before applying the label, it is necessary to define the standard. What precisely is a Republican principle? If the term is to have a meaning, it must be tied to identifiable ideas rather than shifting expectations. Historically, those ideas, the ideals of the Republican Party, have been described as, in very consistent terms, as limited government, fiscal restraint, individual liberty, and adherence to the Constitution as a governing framework. Under that definition, disagreement with party leadership is not disqualifying. Voting against a particular bill is also not disqualifying. Even standing alone as the only person to vote a certain way is not disqualifying. The relevant question is whether or not a representative's actions align with those underlying principles that are outlined by the party platform. If the standard is party agreement, then any deviation becomes grounds for the label. If the standard is constitutional principle, then the evaluation changes entirely. If the party leadership or majority departs from its own stated principles of limited government, fiscal restraint, individual liberty, and adherence to the Constitution, the fault does not lie with those who refuse to follow. It lies with the departure itself. A standard does not change because a majority ignores it. It remains what it is, and it continues to bind those who take it seriously. Think about it like how every single representative, every single president, every single senator, they all swear an oath to the Constitution. How many take that oath seriously? In that circumstance, the question is not why a representative stands apart, but why the center has moved away from the principles it claims to uphold. Before assigning the label, the standard must be clear. Otherwise, the term becomes a substitute for analysis rather than a conclusion drawn from it. When the standard is clarified, the evaluation shifts from accusation to examination. That framework is what defines what a rhino actually is. So, with a defined standard in place, the next step is to apply it across contexts and not selectively. If the principles are limited government, fiscal restraint, individual liberty, and constitutional adherence, then the evaluation must compare those principles directly against the voting record, regardless of which party holds power. A central question follows. If the application of those principles are consistent when different parties control Congress or the executive branch, or is it applied only in opposition to one side? Across multiple sessions of Congress, the observable pattern is not limited to opposition against a single party. On large-scale spending measures, including omnibus packages, advanced under both Republicans and Democrat majorities, the record reflects repeated opposition based on scope and long-term fiscal impact. On surveillance authorities, Massie's resistance to expansion appears in response to proposals supported by both parties at different times. The stated concern is not partisan origin, but the breadth of authority and its alignment with constitutional limits. On foreign intervention, The emphasis on congressional authorization is applied irrespective of which administration is advancing the action. The standard remains tied to the separation of powers rather than the identity of the party in control. These categories provide a useful cross reference. When the same criteria is applied under different political conditions and yields the same type of vote, the pattern suggests consistency of principle rather than selective opposition. This distinction is critical to the evaluation of whether or not an individual is a rhino or not. If opposition appears only when one party governs, it can be interpreted as partisan. If the same positions are maintained when either party advances similar measures, the basis shifts towards principle. When viewed in that context, the record is not defined by alignment or opposition to a party. It is defined by the application of a consistent standard across different legislative environments. The difference is not in isolated votes. It is in whether the same reasoning applies the same outcome when the political circumstances change. Specific examples illustrate this pattern more clearly. On expansive spending, opposition appears under both Republican and Democratic leadership. Under a Republican administration, Thomas Massie has voted against the CARES Act in 2020, citing that its scale, speed, and long-term fiscal implications, despite overwhelming bipartisan support. Under a Democrat administration, the same position continued with opposition to large omnibus bills, appropriations packages, and multi-trillion-dollar spending measures, such as the America Rescue Plan. Again, based on deficit impact and scope, the underlying rationale does not change with party control. The vote reflects the same concern regardless of federal expansion and long-term debt. On surveillance, Thomas Massie has opposed the reauthorization and expansion of FISA, Section 702. He has been consistent against that across all administrations. During Republican leadership, he opposed reauthorization efforts that expanded or maintained broad surveillance powers without additional safeguards. Under Democratic leadership, the same opposition continued subsequently with reauthorization pushes, again citing concerns over scope, civil liberties, and constitutional limitations. And the position is not tied to which party advances that policy, but to whether the authority has been granted to the government to begin with. On foreign intervention and war powers, the emphasis on congressional authorization has been demonstrated across administrations, also with very specific examples. Under President Obama, during the proposed military intervention of Syria in 2013, he opposed authorization for military action, reinforcing the position that entering hostilities requires constitutional justification and congressional approval. Under President Trump, the same standard was applied again. He co-sponsored and supported a bipartisan war powers resolution with Representative Ro Khanna to prohibit unauthorized military action against Iran. This was directly opposing unilateral executive action when advanced by his own party's administration. And just for a little bit of added clarity, the Democrats only really supported this bill because they were acting in partisan faith. They were not acting in constitutional faith. The Democrats are very obviously just strictly against Trump to be against Trump. But Thomas Massie has held these beliefs consistently across all administrations during his 15 years now, I think, in Congress. And in both cases of war powers, the position remains consistent. The determining factor is not the party or the president, but whether the action complies with the constitutional requirement that Congress authorize war. And on fiscal responsibility, the pattern is reinforced again by both votes and legislative action across administrations. Again, under Republican majorities, he opposed deficit spending measures such as the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, and he has also opposed the Big Beautiful Bill, citing the projected impact on deficits despite policy goals. Under Democratic majorities, the same position is seen consistently, with opposition to large spending measures such as the Inflation Reduction Act and omnibus appropriations packages, again based on the cumulative effect on long-term debt. And to put that into perspective, I had an episode three of We the Podcast, where we spoke on the issue of debt. We are now $40 trillion in debt. And by my most recent calculations, we are within 20 years of having a higher interest on our debt than the income that we receive in revenue from taxation and other income. So this is not just a pissing contest. This is not just a nothing issue. This is something that will have catastrophic effects on this country if we do not get this spending under control. So if you want more detail on the fiscal cliff is the name of that episode, please check out episode 3. It goes into great detail on the fiscal cliff that we are racing towards at this point. But getting back to the topic of today, the underlying rationale for Thomas Massie has never shifted with party control. A lot of individuals look at the headlines and they'll see that he voted against the Republicans in this one instance and say he never did that against the Democrats. Well, you're just reading the headlines. You're not actually reading his voting record. The evaluation remains tied to deficit impact and the expansion of federal commitments over time. In addition to votes, Thomas Massie has taken legislative initiatives to further reflect his position. He has supported measures such as the One Subject at a Time Act to limit omnibus legislation. This would make it so that legislators would be forced to vote on each individual line item of a spending package before passing the spending package. This means that their vote is tied directly to one topic, one bill. And this is important because there are a lot of criticisms on what Thomas Massie has refused to fund, when in reality, he's refusing to fund the pork within a bill. He's refusing to fund experimentation on monkeys to see if they have more sex on cocaine or whatever nonsense experiments we keep shoving into all of our bills. We have so many different nonsense things shoved into our bills that Thomas Massie is trying to fight against that. And they shove all of that into the same bills that fund our border security, the same bills that give our soldiers a pay raise, the same soldiers that give the same bills that give a border wall. The problem with the way we are doing our legislation is they trap your representatives to say, if you don't vote yes on this, we are going to criticize you for not funding the military, for not funding DHS, for not funding the border wall, for not funding the immigration enforcement. But Thomas Massie has in multiple instances voted yes on funding for all of these programs. And the only time he is not is when he sees something catastrophically bad in a bill. He's just trying to get the spending under control. He's not trying to cut all spending or refuse to fund important programs. He's trying to hold the legislature responsible. So, in addition to all of this, when you take all of his voting record and legislative activity together, the fiscal discipline within the appropriations process is non existent. These efforts are not tied to a single party in power. They reflect the consistent approach to limiting federal spending growth and maintaining budgetary restraint. The position on fiscal responsibility is applied consistently, regardless of which party is advancing the legislation. On individual liberty, the pattern is reflected on opposition to broad federal mandates and expansion on federal authority across administrations. Under a Republican administration, he opposed reauthorization and expansion of the Patriot Act and related surveillance frameworks. He cited concerns over due process, privacy, and the scope of federal power. Under Democratic administrations, the same standard was applied to federal mandates, including opposition to the nationwide vaccine and employment-related mandates, advancing through executive and regulatory action. On the basis that such authority exceeds the proper scope of federal power and infringes on individual autonomy. And so far, out of everything that I'm seeing out of Thomas Massie's voting record and what he says, there is absolutely nothing rhino about him. In addition, under both Republican and Democratic leadership at the federal and state levels, during the pandemic period, he opposed mandatory shutdowns of businesses. He argued that blanket closures imposed without clear constitutional grounding or legislative authorization infringed on individual liberty and exceed proper governing authority. In all of these circumstances, the position is consistent. The focus is on the policy, the focus is not on the policy objective, but on whether or not the federal government possesses the authority to impose it. When that authority is viewed as exceeding constitutional limits, the response remains the same. On gun rights, the record reflects consistent support for an expansive interpretation of the Second Amendment. He has supported national constitutional carry measures. In fact, he testified for national constitutional carry today in the Senate. In support of Rand Paul's measure for national constitutional carry. So, with support of the national constitutional carry, does that sound like a rhino policy? Does that sound like something a Democrat would do? He's working to remove restrictions on the lawful carry of firearms across state lines. He has also backed efforts to deregulate suppressors and opposed federal bans or restrictions on commonly owned firearms and accessories. In addition, his positions have extended to opposition against federal limitations on fully automatic firearms, arguing that such restrictions exceed the proper scope of federal authority under the Second Amendment. These positions have been maintained regardless of which party is advancing gun control legislation or regulatory expansion. When proposals from Democrat majorities seek to expand federal restrictions, the response is opposition, grounded in the same constitutional protection. When Republican leadership supports a compromising measure or maintained existence of federal restrictions, the position remains unchanged. He's still fighting to have our rights be protected and restored. In this area, the pattern is direct. The standard is applied consistently, and the outcome does not shift with party control. On constitutional adherence more broadly, the pattern is the same It is reflected in specific, repeatable practices tied to how legislation is evaluated. He has consistently required that bills be read and understood before a vote is taken, objecting to unanimous consent on large measures that have not been reviewed in full. This reflects a procedural commitment to Article 1 responsibilities rather than a preference for speed or political expedience. He has supported and introduced efforts such as that One Subject at a Time Act to enforce that single subject discipline and legislation, aimed at preventing the bundling of unrelated provisions into omnibus bills and obscure accountability. He has opposed legislation on the basis that it exceeds enumerated powers, even when the underlying policy objective is broadly supported. In these cases, the objection is not to the objective is not to the outcome, but to the absence of clear constitutional authority. These positions have been applied under both Republican and Democrat majorities consistently throughout Congressman Thomas Massie's career. Taken together, all of these examples reinforce the broader point. The consistency is not situational. When measured against the stated standards of limited government, fiscal restraint, individual liberty, and constitutional adherence, the pattern reflects alignment, not deviation, to the Republican Party platform. If the label is applied on that basis, it is not supported by the record, it is contradicted by it. Voting records show how a representative responds to legislation. Legislative activity shows what they prioritize when given the opportunity to lead. Bills introduced, sponsored, and co sponsored provide a clear view of intent. They reflect not only on positions, but the direction a representative is actively attempting to move policy. Within this body of framework, several things are consistent. As I mentioned before, you have the One Subject at a Time Act. It's aimed at preventing omnibus legislation and restoring transparency. On the fiscal and regulatory restraint, he has supported efforts such as auditing the Fed, emphasized on oversight of monetary policy and transparency in the federal finance operations. On the liberty side and local control, legislation such as the Prime Act has been introduced to reduce federal regulatory barriers on small-scale food producers. On privacy and civil rights, he has supported and co-sponsored measures such as the Fourth Amendment Not for Sale Act, aimed at restricting government access to private data without a warrant, reinforcing constitutional protections in the digital age. These examples are not isolated initiatives, they form a pattern. They demonstrate an attempt to apply constitutional principles proactively, not just defensively. Rather than simply opposing legislation viewed as exceeding federal authority, this body of work reflects an effort to define an alternative framework grounded in limited government, accountability, and individual liberty. When viewed alongside the voting record, the alignment becomes clear. The same principles used to evaluate legislation are the ones being used to create it. It is also necessary to address a related point. Legislative outcomes are not determined by a single member of Congress. A representative can introduce, sponsor, advocate for, and vote for any legislation, good or bad, but passage requires the support of others in the chamber. Where these proposals fail to advance, the cause does not rest with one vote alone. It reflects a broader absence of support among those who have the ability to move such measures forward. In that context, the lack of enacted reform is not solely a reflection of the proposals themselves, but of the willingness or unwillingness of other members to support a return to constitutional limits. The record therefore distinguishes between what is being proposed and what is being permitted. The difference lies not in the availability of alternatives, but in the level of support that they receive. Thomas Massie has given very consistent and problem solving legislation. He's trying to give transparency, but nobody else in government is willing to give that transparency. What are they trying to hide? So, I mentioned earlier about the national debt. I want to talk a little more deeply about that, but again, if you want to have a real deep discussion on the national debt, check out episode 3 of We the Podcast, where we talk about the fiscal cliff that we are fast approaching. The national debt is not an abstract concern. It is the cumulative result of repeated legislative decisions made over time. Total debt levels, combined with rising interest obligations, are now among the fastest growing components of federal spending. Interest alone is on a trajectory to compete with, and in some cases exceed, major discretionary categories. This is not a temporary condition. This is a structural trend. At current rates, the debt expansion and compounding interest projections indicate a trajectory in which interest obligations will approach and potentially exceed federal revenue within the next 2 decades, as I mentioned earlier. That outcome would represent a fundamental shift where servicing past decisions consumes the capacity to fund any present obligations. This is where the context in which prior decisions or discussions of the fiscal cliff were framed. The risk is not tied to a single bill or a single Congress. It is tied to a sustained pattern of deficit spending that compounds over time and narrows future policy options. We cannot be criticizing the one person trying to hold government accountable to spending for trying to hold it accountable to spending. We need to hold everyone accountable that is voting for this nonsense, not the one person who's trying to stop this nonsense. This is where the standard discussed earlier becomes operational. If fiscal restraint is a stated principle, then it must be visible in voting behavior when large-scale spending is proposed, regardless of political pressure or party alignment. The record outlined in the prior segment reflects that approach. The question, therefore, is not whether spending can achieve near-term objectives. It is whether the path being taken remains sustainable, and whether it is consistent with the limits implied by a government of enumerated powers. At a certain point, the issue is no longer theoretical. It becomes a constraint on future governance. In that sense, the debt is not simply a number. It is a measure of accumulated decisions and an indicator of whether stated principles are being applied in practice. At this point, the discussion moves beyond just the evaluation and the consequence. If the standard is constitutional adherence, then the question is not whether a record aligns with those principles. The question is whether the alignment is preserved within Congress. A single member does not define the direction of the institution, but the removal of members who consistently apply constitutional limitations does have a cumulative effect. When those who adhere to the limited government, fiscal restraint, individual liberties are replaced by those who prioritize party alignment and political expediency, the center of that institution shifts. Over time, that shift becomes the normal. This creates a clear point of decision. One path continues the current trajectory, where legislative decisions are driven primarily by outcome and alignment, and where constitutional constraints are secondary. The other path preserves and refines a standard in which federal authority is limited, defined, and applied consistently. These differences determine how laws are written, how power is exercised, and how the Constitution functions in practice. In that context, the presence of members who consistently apply constitutional principles is essential. The removal of that consistency does not simply change a vote count. It alters the direction of the institution itself. The implication is straightforward. If the goal is to restore or maintain constitutional limits within Congress, then those who demonstrate that standard in practice become critical to that effort. The loss of Thomas Massie in Congress, who consistently applies constitutional limits, would have consequences beyond a single seat. It would further shift the institution towards centralized decision-making and away from the principle of limited government and federalism. This principle carries significant implications for the direction of the Republican Party and the broader application of constitutional principles within Congress. It represents a point of decision between continued centralization and a return to limited government. This primary could determine the death or the revival of the Republican Party and the preservation or the destruction of our republic. For these reasons, I strongly encourage every voter in Northern Kentucky to get out and vote for Thomas Massie. Available polling data provides a breakdown across age groups, which offers useful insight into both support levels and turnout dynamics. The data indicates strong support among young voters, moderate support under middle-aged voters, and weaker support among older voters for Thomas Massie. Most importantly, younger voters show a significant margin of support, while older voters show a preference for the challenger Ed. When these support levels are combined with typical turnout numbers, the weighted projection can be calculated. From the age group of 18 to 29, they have approximately 78.5% support for Thomas Massie. However, with a roughly 10% voter turnout, you don't have as much weight with that support. But from the age 30 to 44, Thomas Massie has approximately 65% support, which usually has about 20% turnout. From the age 45 to 64, you're in a dead heat. It's about 53 to 47 in favor of Thomas Massie. They have about a 40% turnout rate. But the age group that has the highest turnout rate on average is 65 and older. but Thomas Massie only has 35% support. Applying these numbers and turnout rates produce a projected outcome of approximately 52.6% in favor of Thomas Massie. This projection reflects a very critical insight. While older voters tend to participate at higher rates, they don't support Massie. The younger voters who do support Massie typically turn out at lower rates. If we want to ensure that Thomas Massie wins this primary and the re-election, we absolutely must reach out to the younger voters in our communities as soon as possible. His primary is in 5 days. The primary is in 5 days. We have to reach out to the younger voters, especially aged 18 to 29, and get them motivated to vote for Thomas Massie to save our Republican Party and our republic. Elections are decided by participation, not by preference. Support that is not converted into votes does not affect the outcome. Turnout does. I know a lot of times it feels like voting does not matter. If voting did not matter, we would not have Thomas Massie in Congress right now. We have to fight to keep Thomas Massie in Congress if we hope to save our Republican Party and our Republican government. The data that I just mentioned makes the dynamic clear. Younger voters show the strongest level of support, yet the lowest participation. That gap between younger voters and older voters is very decisive. If participation remains uneven, the outcome will reflect turnout patterns rather than overall support. If participation shifts, the results shift with it. This is the practical reality of the electoral process. The difference between winning and losing is not measured in opinion. It is measured in whether support is translated into action at the ballot box. I know many are discouraged by government and oftentimes feel like the voting doesn't matter. To an extent, I even agree with you. When you have a choice between a douche and a crap sandwich, voting doesn't really matter. Yes, I stole that reference from South Park, but it's a perfect reference. If you have to vote between a douche and a crap sandwich, voting doesn't matter. However, in this instance, here we have an opportunity to preserve a long-standing, principled statesman. If voting never mattered, we would have lost Thomas Massie long ago. This is not the first time he has been challenged. It is our duty to keep him and reinforce him. We not only need to keep him, we need to find more like him and get them elected. So at its core, this discussion has never been about personality. It has been about standard. A written constitution only carries weight if it is applied, not selectively, not when convenient, but consistently across votes, across administrations, and across time. Tonight's episode has focused on one thing: the application of that standard. When that standard is applied to a public record, the conclusions are no longer speculative. They follow directly from what has been done and not what has been said. If constitutional limits are to mean anything, they have to be enforced in practice. That requires action, not rhetoric, and consistency, not convenience. At this point, the responsibility shifts from analysis to action. You have the voting record. You have the data. You have the context. It's all public record. If you don't believe me, look it up. Now it comes down to whether that translates to participation. If you believe in constitutional limits, if you believe in fiscal responsibility, if you believe in individual liberty, then you are responsible for maintaining constitutional leadership. It must be reflected beyond discussion. Engage with the process. Have the conversations. Make sure those around you understand what is at stake. If you find value in this discussion, please make sure to follow, share, get other people watching this episode, get other people involved. And if you have any comments or perspectives to give, thoughtful discussion matters. It strengthens the conversation around these issues. Because in the end, the direction of both the party and the republic will be determined not by what is said, but by what is done. So thank